In chapter 31, we're going to further develop what salvation really means to us, how it applies to our lives, how we can make some gradient or evaluation of all these different views of religion that are endemic to our postmodern world. So chapter 31 then deals with conceptions of salvation. There are several details that can differ in such a thing. There's the time dimension. Do we see salvation as a series of discontinuous points where we try to progress just one stage to the next, or as a frequently interrupted process in which, to greater or lesser degrees, we're enjoying that reality, or as one process with a number of compartments? How do we really define this whole question of salvation? For example, the Western Church sees salvation generally in terms of a done deal which continues throughout life. For example, if you ask a typical Protestant who falls into the more historical spectrum of what Protestantism is, and you can say, well, do you remember when you were saved? And they might say, yes, I remember the day. I know the time. In other words, they will point to salvation as an event that takes place at a particular time in their life. Whereas the Eastern Christian is going to see salvation in terms of being saved. So it's not so much that he or she has been saved, but rather they are being saved through this process in which they are being restored to what they should have been before sin came into this world. They have a technical name for it. It's called theosis, Theosis. It's also called divinization. It's not that we become gods, but that we become what we should have been before the fall. And then there's a question about the medium. How do we evaluate, for example, the sacraments? You could say salvation is gained through the authority and the power of the church as it administers the rites of Christian initiation. A very popular exposition, most notably baptism and the Lord's Supper. So if you are going to stress the sacraments as the medium of your salvation, then you would fall into that group of people who would say that what saves you is the authority of the church and the authority of the minister appointed by the church and the apostolic tradition as they administer the rites of Christian initiation. So this is what we call baptismal regeneration, which I'll talk about more later. But in other words, you gain salvation through the authority of the church. Now the second medium might be experience. Salvation is gained as the result of moral development and maturation. And if you express experience, then you would simply say, well, I'm getting more and more saved. Or you could say, third, salvation comes through faith in Christ. And we probably would accept this, that salvation does indeed come through faith in Christ. And what about the extent of salvation? Well, some feel all will be saved. Christians generally hold that only Christians will be saved. Perhaps the best answer is to simply affirm the polarities. And what I mean by that, it's an old trick that Luther taught. And that is, if the Bible seems to say things that you can't get together, they just seem opposite, just believe them both and understand it later. And so the answer is, does the Bible teach that God will be unfair to anyone? No. Does the Bible teach that one must believe in Christ to be saved? Yes. Okay, I believe in both. In other words, some things I can't get together. But what God has given us to do is the task of preaching the gospel according to the teachings of Jesus Christ. So there are other conceptions of salvation that transcend just these more specific examples. For example, liberation theology would try to understand salvation in terms of liberation from tyranny. So a liberation theologian, and there's different types of liberation theology. There's Hispanic liberation theology, Black liberation theology, Korean liberation theology. Every ethnicity has some type of liberation theology in which they want to reinterpret salvation and reinterpret glorification politically in terms of overthrowing corrupt rulers. Well, that would be liberation theology. Existential theology represents those theologians who emphasize human experience and de-emphasize having some visible written norm that gives us instructions or teaches us certain principles. They view salvation in terms of authentic existence. So what salvation is in existential theology is if we're living authentically with who and what we are. Well, you can see where that could lead us. Secular theology is when you view theology outside of the context of religion in terms of a coming of age, so that we become independent of God and or a pre-scientific view of the world. One of the foremost secular theologians would be Dietrich Bonhoeffer, often criticized too much because he was living at a time in Nazi Germany when the church was trying to use its confessionalism and its sacraments and its religion to avoid coming face to face with the society of that day. So Bonhoeffer said that God is dead and we must come to an age where we see the world around us. And while his Christology probably is somewhat questionable, he is not an atheist or a person who is advocating something contrary to Christianity, but rather a secularizing of theology which will force his church to come out of their cocoon and their theological shroud. And then evangelical theology, it views salvation in terms of being made right with God through faith in Jesus Christ. And this is the camp that I personally would live in. Of course, the word evangelical means so many things, and these days one wonders really if evangelical has come to be more of a political term than a religious term. But basically, evangelical, just look it up in the dictionary, whatever dictionary you have, involves emphasis upon preaching, an emphasis upon the pulpit as being the very central part of worship, and an emphasis upon personal confession of Christ as being necessary for salvation. And I'm comfortable in that family, but there is more than one family.